Greetings to you. This is Tony Denton coming to you from Phoenix, Arizona on this warm April 25th morning. Around 9 o'clock, I'm here in the air conditioning. Yes, it's already warm enough for that here, sadly. But I'm here to share with you a re-lesson, a re-lesson, which means it's one that I had on the website in PDF form and also on YouTube in audio form like this one for a while, but I've redone it. There's been some studying I've done recently that has made me, I knew I was going to have to do this anyway, but some recent studying has really pushed me to go ahead and get it done. So we're going to talk about Satan in the Old Testament, or as is entitled on my website, the PDF is The Biblical Satan, Part 1, The Hebrew Scriptures. And I've redone some thoughts on this, so if you have heard this or read it, it will be a little different than before. So according to current dictionaries, Satan is defined as a singular spiritual being, the foe of both God and man. But how accurate is this definition? Let's do some digging, starting at the beginning. The Hebrew term for Satan is based on the letters Shin, Teth, Nun, and the Hebrew. And it's believed to be pronounced as Satan, S-A-W-T-A-W-N. With the definition, or the definite article rather, before it, one would add the letter He, H-E-I, at the end. Remember, Hebrew reads from right to left. Yes, a little odd to us English-speaking people. So it would be He Sultan, or just Sultan without the definite article. Now, according to Hebrew lexicographers like James Strong, and this is his number 7854 if you go by the numbers of the Hebrew words, it refers to an opponent or enemy. According to Wilson, it refers to an adversary. According to Gesenius, it refers to an adversary as in war, an enemy. And according to Girdlestone, it refers to an adversary or plotter, one who devises means for opposing another. Now, here are some related terms. The Hebrew verb sultan means to lay snares, follow hostilely, persecute, oppose. The term sultan, or the verb sultan, means to accuse or attack, to be an adversary. The noun sitnal refers to opposition or accusation. I also found it very interesting that the translators of the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament from which Jesus and his disciples most often quoted, chose 89% of the time, mind you, to not translate the Hebrew sultan with the Greek term one would expect, that is, sultanos, which would be the Greek term. In other words, although in the Greek we have sultanos as the equivalent for the Hebrew sultan, both referring to an adversary, 24 of the 27 times in the Hebrew Scriptures, the translators rather chose to employ the term diabolos, referring to an accuser of another, or epibulos, referring to someone who schemes against another in order to accuse him. So, that's interesting because instead of using sultanos to translate sultan, they chose most of the time epibulos or diabolos. The only three verses that actually retain the Greek sultanos for the Hebrew sultan are found in one paragraph, 1 Kings 11, 14, 23 and 25. 1 Kings chapter 11 verses 14, 23 and 25. And all of these are about the same single subject of literal human enemies in war against Solomon, indicating to me that these two terms were understood by ancient Hebrews to be definite synonyms of diabolos and or epibulos. They were that interchangeable. Now, why they didn't use one of those two terms in 1 Kings, I'm not 100% sure, of course. But instead of choosing one of those two words, diabolos or epibulos, they chose satanas in that particular place. So to understand one, to understand sultan or satanas, one would be, to understand one of those would be essentially to understand the other. If you understand diabolos or epibulos, is to understand satanas and sultan, and vice versa. In other words, they're interchangeable. They mean the same thing. And we'll get to the Greek terms more when we do finally get around to the New Testament study, or the Biblical Satan Part 2, the Greek Scriptures. So, the Hebrew term sultan involves two primary characteristics of a being. Number one, accuser, one who attacks by word. And number two, an adversary, one who attacks by word and or physically. And these two types would of course include those who follow others around with hostile motives and persecute them. You know, sort of like the Jews who kept following Paul all over the place and persecuting him. There are those who prowl around like private investigators or police detectives searching for evidence to use against someone, and even those who do the prosecuting itself against others. So it's a very generic term, can be applied to practically anyone who's either trying to find evidence against somebody, or is using evidence to accuse somebody, or is using that evidence to prosecute somebody. You know, it's just a very generic term, and somebody's enemy in one form or another. So we might say that we have here enemy adversary, prowler plotter, and accuser prosecutor. You know, all of that falls under the realm of sultan or satanas, which would be the Greek of sultan. The Hebrew term sultan is found 27 times in the Hebrew Scriptures. And by that I mean in the Tanakh, or the Old Testament. It's found in Numbers 22:22 and 32, 1 Samuel 29:4, 2 Samuel 19:22, 1 Kings 5:4, 1 Kings 11:14, and verses 23 and 25, 1 Chronicles 21:1, Job 1, verses 6 and 7, 8, 9, and 12, and chapter 2 of Job, verses 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, and 7, Psalm 109, verse 6, and Zechariah 3, verses 1 and 2. Now you'll find it multiple times in some of those verses. That's why there's not 27 verses I listed. Except for in the cases of Job and Zechariah, none of them have the definite article before them. In other words, in those two cases, that is Job and Zechariah, the Hebrew reads the sultan, but not in any of the other cases. Now let's consider the cases without the definite article, of which there are essentially only seven places, but multiple times in those 7 paragraphs or passages. In 1 Samuel 29, verse 4, we find the incident in which Philistine lords chose to use the term sultan in reference to King David. In 2 Samuel 19:22, we find the incident in which King David chose to use the term sultan in reference to the sons of Zeruiah. In 1 Kings 5:4, we merely read of how that, at the outset of his reign, King Solomon had no sultan to worry about. But that was soon to change, for in 1 Kings 11, verses 14, 23, and 25, we begin to come across something a little more interesting in our study. Here we have statements about the Lord, quote unquote, the Lord raising up 2 enemies against King Solomon, Sultan Hadad the Edomite, and Sultan Rezon bar Eliadah, with their respective armies. In Psalm 109, verse 6, we read David praying, again, for vengeance against some people. This time he asked that those who had made false accusations against him would have someone he called a sultan to make false accusations against them. Now, I'm going to go backwards because I want these various incidents to be placed in a specific order. I've gone from Numbers to Psalms, but let's go back a little bit to Numbers, chapter 22, and look at that passage a little bit more in depth than we have these others, just flying through these others to note for you who were the sultans of each of those cases. Now, if you're following, turn to Numbers 22 in your Bible. Due to a conversation a prophet named Balaam had with the Lord, he was expected by the Lord to not go with the Moabites to see their king Balak, who wanted Balaam to curse the Israelites. By reading verses 22 through 34, we can see a clear case of Yahweh being the instigator by sending an angel, which merely means messenger or delegate, to be his agent through whom he fulfilled his purpose. So the Lord was the sultan against Balaam. Okay, let's look at that real quickly here. Numbers 22:22. Then God's anger was aroused against because he went, and the angel of the Lord took his hand in the way. Stand. I'm reading with some bad glasses here. I need to get this book farther away from me so I can see it better. Okay, the angel of the Lord took his stand in the way as an adversary against Balaam. And he was riding on his donkey, and his 2 servants were with him. Now the donkey saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way with his drawn sword in his hand, and the donkey turned aside out of the way and went into the field. So Balaam struck the donkey to turn her back onto the road. Then the angel of the Lord stood in a narrow path between the vineyards, with a wall on this side and a wall on that side. And when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she pushed herself against the wall and crushed Balaam's foot against the wall, so he struck her again. Then the angel of the Lord went further and stood in a narrow place, where there was no way to turn either to the right hand or to the left. And when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she lay down under Balaam. So Balaam's anger was aroused, and he struck the donkey with his staff. Okay, this is the 3rd time now. Then the Lord opened the mouth of the donkey, and she said to Balaam, "What have I done to you that you have struck me these 3 times?" And Balaam said to the donkey, as if it was normal for the donkey to speak to him, he said, "Because you've abused me. I wish there were a sword in my hand, for now I would kill you." So the donkey said to Balaam, "Am I not your donkey on which you have ridden? Ever since I became yours to this day, was I ever disposed to do this to you?" And he said, "No." Then the Lord opened Balaam's eyes, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way with his drawn sword in his hand, and he bowed his head and fell flat on his face. And the angel of the Lord said to him, "Why have you struck your donkey these 3 times? Behold, I have come out to stand against you, because your way is perverse before me. The donkey saw me and turned aside from me these 3 times. If she had not turned aside from me, surely I would have also killed you by now and let her live." And Balaam said to the angel of the Lord, "I have sinned, for I did not know you stood in the way against me. Now therefore, if it displeases you, I will turn back." The angel of the Lord said to Balaam, "Go with these men, but only the word that I speak to you, that you shall speak." So Balaam went, and the princes. So he went with the princes of Balak. So, when you read that, you can't help but see who the Sultan of the story was. It was the Lord himself through the agency of an angel. Now, lastly in this list, turn to 1 Chronicles, if you're following, for a verse that will connect to one in 2 Samuel. Okay? 1 Chronicles and then 2 Samuel. In this general story, the Lord is again upset with his wife Israel for her lack of love for and hence faith in him, essentially treating him like dirt. So in 1 Chronicles 21 verse 1 we find the following. Sultan stood up against Israel, moving David to number Israel, which simply means to take a census, in this case of his armies. Now, turn to 2 Samuel 24 verse 1. In this record of the exact same event, we find this stated. The anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel, so he moved David against them to say, go number Israel and Judah. So, according to 2 Samuel, who actually played the role of the Sultan, which is the word used in the 1 Chronicles? Right, the Lord. 'Tis much like saying, it's much like some of the preceding cases we've looked at, where we've not found yet one case at all referring to some supernatural evil being. In every case, it's either been a man or men or an angel of the Lord and or therefore the Lord himself. In Psalm 109, David asked the Lord to use someone as a sultan against his enemies. In 1 Kings 11, the Lord used Hadad Razan as a sultan against King Solomon. In Numbers 22, the Lord sent an angel or agent as a sultan against Balaam. And now here in Chronicles of Samuel, the Lord himself is clearly indicated to have been a sultan against his wife Israel for not exhibiting her alleged love and faith. Now, we can therefore say that the Lord is Satan. Now that sounds pretty horrible to us because of the way we were raised. But there are times clearly in the Old Covenant Scriptures and the Hebrew Scriptures where the Lord is Satan, where he played the role of a Satan, that is, an enemy, an adversary, like in Numbers 22, where he stood in the way, stood against Balaam. So he played the role of Satan to Balaam. Now, before we move to Sultan passages with the definite article, let me say a couple things here. Firstly, relative to the definite article or lack thereof, scholars are at odds because some say that if the definite article is present, then it's a reference to the specific enemy of God and man called the devil, while without the definite article, it's merely a reference to any given enemy in general. But others say that with the definite article, it's referring to a specific enemy in a given context, while without the definite article, it's referring to the name of the devil they say is Satan. So you can't go to scholars in general and know what in the world to think, because they're at total odds with one another. If you are looking at my PDF while listening to this, or not, if you aren't, go back and find it and read that paragraph 2 or 3 times. You'll see these guys have no idea where to go with this. So it's a no-win situation when it comes to studying these guys. Secondly, here's my current thinking. From my studies right now, it seems to me that just because the cases we considered so far don't have the definite article doesn't really mean anything in contradistinction to the passages which do include it, as some would make a big deal out of. So think about this. Had David turned on the Philistines and begun to war with them, then in that case, without other variables involved, such as other enemies, he would have been fulfilling the functional role of the Sultan of the story. Had Zeruiah's sons turned on David and begun to war with him, then in that case, they would have been fulfilling the role of the Sultan of the story. Had there been a story about a war between Solomon and Hadad, then in that case, Hadad would have been fulfilling the functional role of the Sultan of the story. Now, my point is, In these cases we've already talked about earlier, it doesn't matter whether there's a "the" there or not there, whether there's a definite article or not, because it depends on how the story is written out, and to if we find the exact things that we need. In fact, let me just go on with the next paragraph here. Not only has there not been the semantics which would call for a definite article in those cases, but there also hasn't been a narrative which would have called for the definite article. For there to be a sultan specific enough to call for the definite article in any given narrative, not only would the correct semantics need to exist, of course, but also the sultan of that story would have to have his counterpart. If the sultan is an accuser, for example, then there'd need to be the accused in the story. Okay, now all of that may be a little confusing, which means you need to go back and get my PDF and read those 3 paragraphs again and get that in your head, because it is somewhat important to do that. One more thing, since the 2 definite article instances in the Hebrew Scriptures are both prophetic in nature, yes, Zechariah's vision and the story of Job, I believe, are foreshadowings, then these 2 narratives don't lend much at all to the popular doctrine of Satan. But let me share with you what I mean. Let's consider the cases with the definite article, of which there are essentially only 2. In Zechariah chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, we read of a vision of 2 individuals standing before an angel of the Lord in a court-like setting. Joshua the high priest and the sultan, Joshua's accuser. The accused and the accuser standing before God, or at least an angel of God, an agent of God. Such makes perfect sense without making the sultan of this passage refer to one specific metaphysical being, cause chaos everywhere, as most of Christendom today seems to believe. In other words, this passage tells us that Zechariah saw Joshua the high priest standing before the agent or the angel of the Lord, and the sultan standing to his right to accuse him. Then the Lord, in this case the agent of the Lord, the angel of the Lord, said to the sultan, "The Lord rebuke you," that is, the sultan. Firstly, how do we even know that the sultan of this passage was any more supernatural than Joshua? Okay, that's my point here so far. We cannot know. There's nothing there to even imply that this accuser of Joshua was any more supernatural than Joshua. We just have 2 people standing there. Joshua, his accuser. Okay, that's the picture that's painted in Zechariah 3. Nothing at all about there being some supernatural evil being or accuser or adversary or devil standing there with Joshua. So, and this is what I'm now thinking, maybe what Zechariah the prophet was seeing were 2 people denoting 2 parties. Now, I'm saying that's what I'm thinking now because I see no evidence otherwise, and I'm open if you have some reason to think otherwise. So we have 2 parties. One, Joshua representing sinful, yet God's remnant, Israel, as she became sinless Israel in and through Christ, the true Israel. And number 2, the Sultan standing there representing the rest of Israel who, as a collective, rejected Christ and became known as the accuser of the brethren, Revelation 12, verse 10. Now, unless you're a full preterist, you probably won't know where I'm going with this or understand what I'm saying right here at this point. But you'll see more about it in just a second here. Okay, but what I'm saying is this. Zechariah 3, the prophet Zechariah is picturing something that was meant to picture something future. Okay, it's like a type antitype type situation, a foreshadowing of something. Where Joshua, again, this is not the Joshua of of Caleb and Joshua. This is a different Joshua. This is Joshua the high priest. This Joshua, again, let me say it one more time, represents the remnant of Israel, who, yes, they were sinful, but they would become sinless in Christ later. And then we have the Sultan, who represents the rest of Israel who rejected Christ and who became the accuser of the brethren. So you have the majority of the Jews who rejected Jesus accusing to God those who have left Moses for Christ because they didn't believe in Jesus being the Christ, okay? So get that picture in your head, just for the sake of argument at least. Think about this. Okay, so you have Joshua picturing new covenant Israel, and the Sultan picturing old covenant Israel as they were battling one another during the first generation of Christianity. Okay, in the New Testament times. But see, until all things were said and done, that old rejecting Israel would not admit that Christians were, as Zechariah 3 verses 3 through 5 go on to demonstrate, the cleansed and accepted ones of God. And check out Romans 8:30 through 39 about that, as well as Daniel 7:22. See, the whole New Testament, everything when you read the New Testament scriptures, when you read the Greek scriptures from Matthew to Revelation, keep in mind one theme. It was during the time when there was a battle between who exactly were God's people. Old covenant Israel, or now these new covenant people. That's the battle. Everything you read somehow fits into that picture of that historical picture of the times. Okay? And that's what's pictured here in Zechariah 3. There was a choosing that was going to come. God was going to come through his son Jesus, of course, and choose and manifest who his true people were. And we know today that he chose Christians over Israel who rejected Jesus. Of course, most of those Christians were Jews, the Jews who accepted Christ. See, the Lord's angel here in Zechariah 3, he lifted up to the Lord himself to rebuke the Sultan. The angel didn't do it. He left it up to the Lord. Now, does this little story here in Zechariah 3 sound like another? Listen to Jude 9. Jude verse 9. The archangel Michael, in contending with the diabolos, that's the Greek word, and it's if you look in, it's like Sultan over in Zechariah 3. Okay? Picture Zechariah 3 now as you read Jude verse 9. You have an angel, Michael, contending with a diabolos, an enemy, an accuser, when he disputed about the body of Moses, which I believe is equivalent to Zechariah 3's Joshua, both representing God's people. Okay, you have Moses and Jude, the body of Moses, and you have Joshua, the high priest of Moses' people, in Zechariah 3. And Jude goes on to say, verse 9, he dared not, that angel, Michael, dared not bring an accusation against the diabolos, or the Sultan of Zechariah 3, a reviling accusation, but said, the Lord rebuke you. Now, how someone cannot see that Jude 9, and maybe in verse 23, isn't a parallel to Zechariah 3, 1 through 5, I just have no idea how you cannot see that. It's very important. So you have Michael, the angel, you have God's people, the Old Covenant Israel, body of Moses, and of course in New Testament times you have those who were accepting Jesus as opposed to those who were not. Now I'm just going on too long here, longer than I want to go. So you can think about all that some. Just mull it around in your mind and think about how this all fits together. So I need to move on here. There's nothing here to support the belief and teaching of some supernatural evil being who's the singular, accuser of mankind before his Creator. That's not what it's about. In fact, we learn in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 11, that a plural number of beings, or angels if you will, were said to have the ability to accuse people before God. They just didn't do it. Okay? So just the very fact that Peter said a plural number could be accusers knocks out the whole concept of there being one singular being who's accusing people before God. That's not what it's about. In the Bible times, it was about God's people, some of God's people, accusing the other part of God's people of something. You know, like one brother saying, so-and-so did it, my brother so-and-so did it. Or the other brother saying, no, that brother did it. We had that case here recently with our two grandkids. Each one blaming the other for something, and we know one of them did it. There was nobody else who could have done it. And neither one of them wanted to take responsibility. So that's what was happening most of the time among God's people, and blaming each other for stuff and accusing one another of things. And so that's what you have in the New Testament times. Whereas at least they thought they were right. You had the New Covenant people, those who were accepting Jesus Christ as the remnant of Romans 11 and verse 5, and those who were not accepting Jesus as the Messiah and accusing to God these Christians who had left his Mosaical law. And of course, Christians saying, sorry, we're actually the ones God has chosen because we are following that which the Mosaical law brought into being, which brought into force. You guys are just missing it. And so until Jesus came and chose who were his people at the judgment of AD 70, then that fight continued on. Now, for the last case in the Tanakh, although the Sultan of Job is expected to be seen throughout the entire 42 chapter story, we only find the Sultan specifically mentioned in Job chapter 1 and 2. So if you're following, Job chapter 1 verses 6 through 12, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan, the Sultan, also came among them. And the Lord said to the Sultan, from where do you come? So the Sultan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth, and from walking back and forth on it. Then the Lord said to the Sultan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil? So the Sultan answered the Lord and said, does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge around him, around his household, and around all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But now stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. And the Lord said to the Sultan, behold, all that he has is in your power, only do not lay a hand on his person. So the Sultan went out from the presence of the Lord. Now chapter 2, begin at verse 1. Again there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and the Sultan came also among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to the Sultan, from where do you come? So the Sultan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth, and from walking back and forth on it. Then the Lord said to the Sultan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil? And still he holds fast to his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without cause. So the Sultan answered the Lord and said, skin for skin, yes, all that a man has he would give for his life. But stretch out your hand now. This is Satan telling God, stretch out your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will surely curse you to your face. And the Lord said to the Sultan, behold, he is in your hand, but spare his life. So the Sultan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with painful boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, etc. So you see that as I read that, it's the Sultan all through this, because there's a very specific accuser in this case. Now, firstly, as we stated earlier, I believe Job, like Zechariah, was prophetic in nature. And you're probably saying, how is that? Well, that would take up an entire talk all of its own, which I do want to put together one day. But in short, I now believe Job is a story picturing the history of Israel from her beginning to her glorious end. And so, as a living parable, what happened in Job's life represented what had and would happen in the life of Israel. Thus, the Sultan represented the prowler, accuser, and enemy of God's people, at least the remnant of his people. Often, or even most of the time, being found within her own ranks, as we already talked about. Oh, and as with anything relative to God's work in all of this, he used the enemies to suit his purposes, which is why Job could constantly attribute to God what was happening to him. Look at chapter 2, verse 10, and the beginning of the book of Job, and chapter 42, verse 11, just for two instances of this case, where Job lays it at God's feet what's happening to him. So, there we have God, in a sense, being the Sultan again. And secondly, unless this is truly the only exception in all of Scripture, I no longer believe the Sultan in Job was some unearthly being either. Rather, as with the only other case, and only other similar case that is found in Zechariah 3, where there is nothing to even imply that the Sultan was an unearthly being there, the picture provided in Job is merely of someone, a fault finder, of God's children among a gathering of God's children. Concerning this Sultan, consider the following. God had referred to this fault finder as someone who had been roaming to and fro in the earth, Job 1:7, as well as chapter 2 and verse 2. Does that remind you of another statement somewhere? In 1 Peter 5 verse 8, before the accuser was cast out of God's presence, according to Revelation 12 verse 10, Peter warned his Israelite Christian audience to be sober and vigilant because their adversary, and that's from a court term, Antidikos, the Diabolos, that is the accuser, was roaming about like a roaring lion, seeking who all he might devour. Now see, just like we had Jude 9 for Zechariah 3, we have 1 Peter 5:8 for Job 1 and 7 and Job 2 and 2. That's how somebody couldn't see that somehow, I don't know. So who was the Antidikos Diabolos of 1 Peter 5:8? Or who was this adversary accuser? Well, is it merely coincidence that Zephaniah 3, verse 3, not only prophesied that the leaders of Israel would be wolves, but also roaring lions? Hardly. Again, it would be so difficult for me to see how somebody could not make the connection with the Jewish Hebrew Peter taking the minds of his Hebrew audience in 1 Peter back to Zephaniah 3 when he used the phrase roaring lion. Okay? So you have Peter referring not to some supernatural evil being, but back to the leaders of Israel who God through Zephaniah called the roaring lions. So put that into Job's picture. Who's against God's people? Who did God himself in various places blame for the troubles of his people? That's right, the leaders of Israel. The leaders, they were the wolves and the roaring lions, just like with our country has been in so many years in the past, with terrible leaders who are out for nothing but for themselves. Anyway, I'm going to get off too far if I go into that kind of stuff. See, as is the case so often, we once again have here the idea of a collective singular being expressed for a corporate group. And what I'm saying is, 1 Peter 5:8, even though it's singular, is referring to the same thing as Zephaniah 3 and 3, even though it's singular in Peter and plural in Zephaniah, because we have a corporate deal with Peter, including all the individuals of that corporate body, being the leaders of Israel from Zephaniah 3 and verse 3. Same thing you have with Antichrist and Antichrists, plural. The Antichrist was the word used for the whole corporate or collective body of the Antichrists. And the Antichrists were those who did not believe Jesus was the Christ. And who were they? The Jews who rejected Jesus as the Christ, especially the leaders of Israel, who even had him killed, crucified. So we have, that's the thing. I'm getting too much into information on the New Testament right now when it comes to Satan. I'm kind of giving away a bunch of stuff, but the Satan of the New Testament, generally, almost in every case, was referring to the Jewish leaders. They were the house of Satan in Revelation 3:10 and 2:10 and so on. But again, we'll have to wait till another time to get more into depth into all of that. So Israel's leaders, the high priests, the Sanhedrin, and so on, were lions plural, but they as a group were a lion singular. Kind of like 2 Timothy 4 verse 17, where Paul said he'd been delivered out of the mouth of the lion. Also check out Acts 22 and verse 30, Acts 23 and verse 12, where Paul was being accused by the leaders of Israel for his Christianity. However, remember, Job's life story in this book is like Hosea's life story in his book, a living parable, which is why Job didn't say that some supernatural evil being did all those sad things to him, or that leaders of Israel did all those sad things to him, but realizing he was being used by God as a living parable, laid the source of his afflictions at the feet of God. Job 1, 21 and 22, Job 2 and verse 3, Job 42, verse 11, and so on. In chapter 2, verse 3, God said to this Sultan that he influenced God to move against Job. Now think about that. God said through Job, in the book of Job, that the Sultan influenced or moved God against Job. So if this is some supernatural evil being instead of a representative of the corporate people of the leaders of Israel or something like that, then it begs the question, who's actually in charge? This supernatural evil being who pushed God into doing something? Or is God the one in charge? Well, in summary, I believe all the narratives about the Sultan, without the definite article, are to be taken at face value as referring primarily to the Lord himself, even if what he desired to accomplish was through the agency of some chosen delegate. And I believe the narratives about the Sultan with the definite article were meant to be prophetic pictures of what had happened, was happening, and or what would happen in the course of God's strategy of man's conciliation to him. See, with all this Old Testament information before us that we've just looked at, we really shouldn't be as dismissive of the Hebrew Scriptures as we've been influenced to be in our modern Christian world. For, as Paul conveyed in Romans 15:4, these things were written to learn from. You know, we've heard the motto that the Old Covenant is the New Covenant concealed, while the New Covenant is the Old Covenant revealed. But since the New Covenant is founded in and upon the Old, then, especially since we've been influenced to be so dismissive of the Old Covenant, I've become convinced that the adage should be switched. For us today, the New Covenant has become the Old Covenant concealed, while the Old Covenant is, if we study it, the New Covenant revealed. We just don't study the Old Covenant enough to understand the New. Or we don't go back to the Old Covenant when the New Covenant refers to the Old Covenant in order to help us to understand what's being said in the New Covenant. The New Covenant is very, very small. The New Testament Scriptures is a very, very small part of the entirety of the Bible. You know that. It's like, what, a fourth of the Bible, the New Testament? Why? Because everything that was alluded to in the New Testament can be found in the Old. So we don't have to do it, didn't have to write it all over again. Just go back and figure out what he's talking about. And if somebody makes an allusion to something in the Old Testament Scriptures, go back to the Old Testament and figure out what the context is of that allusion. It's very, very important to do that. This subject right here is one of those cases. What's the Satan of the Old Testament? A mere enemy. A man, several men, some delegate that God himself has sent, or God himself. There's not a case of a supernatural evil being created by God to create chaos. Nothing in the Old Testament of that. And since the New Testament is based on the Old, that gives us a real important foundation right there to try to understand Satan in the New Covenant as well, which hopefully I will get to sometime before too long. Thank you for listening. This went over at least 10 minutes longer than I was hoping it would be, because I just can't seem to keep from going off and chasing my rabbits. But anyway, I thank you for taking the time to listen to this, and please do go back and get the PDF and read through it, because it will help you understand a lot better if you haven't done that as you were listening. Again, thanks for your time, and we'll see you down the road.